Okay, chapter 5, part 2. We finished off. We were talking about movies. We looked at some key issues. We looked at marketing, and then the last thing we talked about was some of the ethics of movie making. And now we want to look a little bit at television. Um, Another very powerful, very dominant form of visual expression, right? If you look at the statistics, it's a little bit scary. Children between 8 and 18 spend 6.5 hours rather per day in front of a screen, and much of that time is spent watching television. Television is still very, very dominant, even in the computer age. The average viewer who lives to be 75 will have watched TV for 11 years of his or her life. That's the average person. Some people that watch more TV, it will be more than 11 years, right? 97% of households in America have at least one television. That's actually surprising. I would have thought it would be more. I would have thought 99% of households. But nonetheless, I mean, obviously, I mean, this is something that's completely pervasive in American society, and not just in American society. It's everywhere. And again, we can get into all kinds of discussions and debates about, is this a good thing? Educational television notwithstanding, is it a good thing that people are spending so much time in front of TV sets? One of the things that struck me when I was living in Egypt, and I think I mentioned this at the start of on the first lecture that I uploaded. But I lived in Egypt for 2.5 years, from 2011 until 2014, and everybody has a TV set there. Egypt is a very, very poor country. I mean, people are living in acute poverty, right? People live in just like a lot of people live in these abandoned buildings that are not even finished. There are a lot of homeless people. There are people who live in the graveyards, which is one of the saddest things that I saw. But everybody has a TV set. It's incredible. You'll be I would walk by these abandoned buildings. They just look like they're abandoned. They're not finished at all. There's no like finishing. It's just dirt and it's just gravel and just walls, brick. And there'd be satellite dishes on the top of these buildings, and people are inside. They have, they're living there, and they have TV sets, small little TV sets, and they're watching TV. So, and Egypt is a society where 40% of the people are illiterate, and so television becomes very important, very powerful in terms of just. And we talk about cultural transmission, but also surveillance, right? Because people learn about what's going on in the society through TV. Americans also use television more than other mediums for entertainment purposes. I mean, TV is an entertainment-based medium in many ways. I mean, it certainly can be used for news, but there are a lot of criticisms about television news in this country, and also in Egypt for that matter, and probably elsewhere. But I'm very familiar with Egypt and also the United States. Those two media systems. I'm more familiar with those two media systems than any other. And there are tons of criticisms, if you look at the research literature, about television news in those societies. But the internet arguably represents a threat to television because more people are watching programs that are not live. So what you can do now with your TV, with your computers and your tablets, and smartphones, I guess also, and internet access, is you can log on to certain websites and watch television programming. You don't have to be there live. It's kind of that on-demand culture that we talked about, right? You can watch what you want when you want to watch it on one of your devices. You don't have to sit through the commercials, right? So that's a lot more. That's a more attractive option for a lot of people, and that's probably why only 97% of U.S. households have a TV. Because what I've learned, and for some of my students from last semester, they said we don't have TVs. We just watch what we want. We got Netflix, Hulu Plus, Amazon Prime, or some combination of those, and they just watch whatever they want in terms of movies and TV shows whenever they want. That on demand culture, and they just watch on their computers. So Um, and I mean, this is a good transition, I guess. Speaking of on demand, we have the ability now to time shift and place shift. So we can record a TV program and watch it later, right? That's time shifting, or listen to it later, as it were. And we can also place shift, that is, viewing television from anywhere using the internet to access video originally delivered digitally to the home or another location. So, this is very convenient for people, and it's kind of I think you can probably predict that this is probably the wave of the future. Who knows what things are going to be like in 20 or 30 or 40 years, but I can see, on the horizon where a lot of shows will just eventually they'll just release online. We mean they won't need a time slot on a particular channel. So we'll just have to we don't want to put the cart before the horse, but I do think that the internet represents a significant threat in the long term, right? In the long run, for traditional TV outlets, TV channels, and networks. And I think a lot of them will make the best of it. They'll transition and do a lot more stuff online. So let's just look a little bit, just kind of how we do with movies and photography. Look a little bit at the history here, just briefly. So you had the cathode ray tube, conceived in 1859 by a German named Julius Plucker, and the cathode ray tube was a device that used electron beams to transmit images to a screen. Don't ask me how that works. I'm not super tech savvy as it is, and so I couldn't begin to explain, the nuts and bolts of that. But it's pretty remarkable. I mean, this is in 1859, so that's 160 years ago or so. In 1923, Scott John Logie Baird created Baird Television, which was the first mechanically scanned TV device to profit from sending pictures through the air. Now this is 1923, so remember, we're into the movie era, right? I mean, we're into Hollywood. Remember D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, that was released in 1915, the first full-length film. So now we have the first mechanically scanned TV device that profits from sending pictures through the air. This is 1923. In 1927, Philo Farnsworth transmitted the first wireless electronic image, and that was the first step toward electronic television. And then in 1939, NBC began broadcasting to 400 TV sets in the New York area, right? I mean, I'm just highlighting some of these, milestones on the path, but there were other things that were happening. But in 1939, this is a big deal. Now it's still only 400 TV sets. That's a tiny number, but that things start to take off slowly from there. And by the time 1946 came, there were 7,000 sets and 9 stations in the U.S. But note, it would have been a lot more than that had it not been for World War II. Development was slowed greatly by World War II and specifically U.S. involvement when the U.S. Entered the war. But by 1949, now there were post-war period, things start to expand dramatically. By 49, you have 98 stations in 58 markets, and by 1950, nearly 4 million U.S. households had a television. And that was the spark that was needed. Once you get to those kinds of numbers, it's just a matter of time before things diffuse. I mean, we have a theory in our field, which we'll talk about later in the term, called the diffusion of innovations, that actually kind of provides insights into how things like TV diffuse into society. But by 1955, now you're up to 65% of U.S. households with a TV. And then by 1960, 87%. So almost everybody has at least one television by 1960. Remember, now it's 97%. So between 1960 and 2015, we've only had that 10% increase. So pretty much by 1960, overwhelming majority of Americans had a TV. And color television debuted in 1951, but it was not popularized until much later. Much of the early programming for television came from radio. Radio and film westerns were very popular in those early years. A little bit later on, children's shows, situation comedies, and news talk shows developed. And later, you get this formal division where you had entertainment, sports, and news, right? Now, later on, there were more categories added. For example, now we have the reality TV, which is still kind of an entertainment, but a lot of times people categorize that in a different genre. But at the 1950s represented kind of a golden era. You'll hear people talking about the golden era of TV. You had shows like I Love Lucy, Gunsmoke, The Honeymooners, Twilight Zone, The Ed Sullivan Show. I don't know if you've ever seen these shows. You guys most of you are probably pretty young, but there's a channel that I'm sure you're familiar with called TV Land, and I think it's called TV Land, or is it? It was called Nick at Night. There was Nickelodeon at Night, and I want to say that they transferred a lot of the content to TV Land, but I could be wrong about that. Anyways, there's a network out there that, if you look for it, they air a lot of these old programs. So you can still see some of these 1950s era programs. You should check them out sometimes just to see kind of some of the differences. There were some significant differences. I remember one thing that I was reading about recently, and I hadn't picked up on this. I saw this show a few times, reruns when I was young. It was called the Dick Van Dyke Show. It starred Dick Van Dyke and Mary Tyler Moore. And they were married on the show, right? And one of the things that was interesting is they slept in different beds, even though they were married, right? Because that was something that was American society wasn't ready at that time for, a married couple to be on the TV screen. They're not really married, right, in real life, and so to be sleeping in the same bed. So that's just sometimes we lose sight of the fact that values and morals. In some cases, they change, right, over time. So we forget sometimes how quickly things changed in this society. By the 1970s, many more developments. You get more realistic, complex storylines and characters. A lot more educational programming. Sesame Street debuted in the 1970s. It became a foundational program for kids, and is actually now, it's in many languages and in many countries. Sesame Street is, right? Monday Night Football began in 1970. That became an institution in American society, right? Very quickly. Monday Night Football still, going strong now, 45 years later. There was controversy in the 1970s with many programs, but one really good example is All in the Family. All in the Family was a show. Again, I don't know if you've seen this show, but I'm sure the reruns still show on some channel out there. But there was a character on the show named Archie Bunker, and he was a racist character, right? And it was controversial, not because there were no racists in America. There were plenty of them, but the controversy was that Archie Bunker was this really kind of, fun-loving guy, right? If you watch the show, you got the sense that the way he was being portrayed, he was fun-loving, he was caring, he was funny, right? You're always laughing at him, and then you kind of said, well, wait a minute, but this guy's a racist, right? The reason why it was controversial, because a lot of people were saying, well, maybe we shouldn't have this kind of positive portrayal or sympathetic portrayal of a guy who's a racist. That was one perspective, and that kind of dovetails with what I was talking about last time, with the kind of the positive portrayals, the sympathetic portrayals of criminal behavior or other immoral behaviors that we find in the movies. And people were offended by The movie Pretty Woman. It was a very sort of, according to many people, it was a very sort of positive portrayal of a prostitute, right? For some people, that was not, that was unacceptable, to have that kind of a portrayal. You have the movie, I mentioned Blue Streak, but you also have the, I mentioned Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I mean, that's much more innocent, I guess, but, kids skipping school and lying and tricking everybody, and it was very funny, and you loved Ferris, right? That was the whole point. Whoever wrote that movie. You've all seen Ocean's 11, Ocean's 12, Ocean's 13. They're robbing a casino, or casinos, and it's a very positive portrayal. In the end, they're kind of rewarded. You're kind of rooting them on. That's how it's written. You're not rooting against them. You want them to get away with it, right? And then, I mean, we could go on and on and on and on. So, All in the Family was a controversial program way back, 40 some odd years ago. Police dramas debuted in the 1970s. Those are obviously very popular today. Cable emerged in the 1980s. I still remember when we got cable. It was like, I mean, I don't know what it was like, but it was like, the people that were alive when, this is probably an exaggeration, but the people that were alive when cars were introduced. Like you're taking the bus, you're taking the train, and all of a sudden there's cars, and you can buy a car and get around yourself. That must have been, incredible. Well, TV was similar. I can remember this. I think I was 8 or 9 years old. I think it was 1984 or 1985 when we got cable. And so we just had the traditional channels. It was like ABC, CBS, NBC, and then there was like PBS, I think. I think that was it. And then all of a sudden we had cable, and we had, dozens and dozens and dozens of channels, right? And all these different, these categorizations, and we had sports channels and news channels and music channels and whatever. All these different channels. So it was pretty incredible, and it impacted society in pretty significant ways. MTV, HBO, CNN became very popular, very influential networks. Soap operas, game shows, sports. These are types of programming that have been around for a long time, but the programming itself kind of changes. Soap operas have become more racy. Game shows have become more extreme, right? More is at stake. Sports shows have become more extreme. This is not really a sports show per se, but talking about extreme, there was the show called, what was it called? Where they put people in Fear Factor. I don't know if you saw that, but I don't think it's on the air. I'm pretty sure it's not on the air anymore. But this was a show, or maybe it is. I don't know. I don't watch that much TV. A few shows that I watch or whatever. But Fear Factor was like they would put people in these situations of obviously of great fear, and if they could overcome their fears and go through whatever the challenge was, they would eventually, if they outlasted other people, they would win, and they would win a lot of money. But it was disgusting. People had to eat cockroaches and do all kinds of, absurd things. But that's the kind of thing. You have to take a step back and kind of think, like, why are shows like that popular? And you can sit back and criticize, and maybe some of the criticism is justified of all the racy content and extreme content that we have out there. And you can criticize the people who make the shows, and maybe that's fair. But I think you also have to point a finger at society. We want those shows, or maybe not me, maybe not you, but people want those shows, and that's why they make money, right? If you look at sports content is quite successful. If you look at the present day, think about something like the Super Bowl or the World Cup. Incredible draws, right? Internationally, particularly the World Cup. We forget sometimes in the U.S. American football is not popular anywhere outside of the United States. A little bit in Canada, a little bit in England. That's pretty much it. Very few fans outside of the United States and Canada. And everywhere else, soccer is the number one sport, pretty much everywhere else. And so the World Cup is a huge draw. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of millions of people who watch the World Cup. But the Super Bowl is also a significant draw, even globally. I mean, there are significant numbers who turn out to watch the Super Bowl, even outside of the United States. ESPN earns $6 billion in subscriber fees annually. So, I mean, that just gives you some insight into how successful sports content is on television. And I mean, ESPN is obviously kind of the pinnacle, right? And they're everywhere. I mean, ESPN. Let me just go back. ESPN is. I mean, I lived in Egypt, as I mentioned. I had ESPN. Just on my cable. I'm not cable. I'm sorry. My satellite dish package. You could sign up for an additional amount or whatever. Pretty nominal, actually, not super expensive. And you could get ESPN, what they called ESPN America, but then they also had ESPN International. There was ESPN Classic, ESPN News, all these different ESPNs. And sometimes they're the same as the things that we're seeing here, but in some cases they're different. Different anchors, different sports that they highlight. So ESPN is truly a global phenomenon. Reality shows, which I mentioned, are obviously very popular. Cops and America's Funniest Home Videos were actually two of the first reality TV shows. And along with Candid Camera. Sorry, I didn't see that. And I always forget about Candid Camera, but that was actually a classic show that I want to say debuted in the 1970s, but don't quote me on that. But that was one that became very popular in the U.S. and was also transported. They had different Candid Camera shows in many different countries. Cops and America's Funniest Home Videos followed, so they were also two of the first reality TV shows. But now things have changed significantly. I mean, we've gone beyond those early portrayals, and now you have reality shows that about weight loss. Something very specific like The Biggest Loser. You have The Real World, Extreme Makeover, House Hunters. I mean, you probably know a lot more of these shows than I do. But a lot of these shows have become very popular, not only here, but in other countries as well. And they have a lot of these shows, by the way, in other countries. I mean, they have, like in Egypt, in the Arab, it's not just in Egypt, in the Arab region, they have, and I forget what it's called now in Arabic, but they have The Biggest Loser now, right? I mean, it's just like, I mean, it's copyrighted. I mean, they haven't stolen it. I mean, they do it with the permission of The Biggest Loser, so it's been transported to these other societies. So a question is, how real are reality TV programs? And if we were in class right now, we can have a nice, interesting debate about this. And there's always, 2 or 3 different points of view among the students. But from one perspective, it's certainly much more real than anything else we have on television because it's not scripted, right? On the other hand, they put people in particular situations knowing what's going to happen, right? I mean, you kind of know how people are going to respond, number one. Number two, we don't see everything. I mean, the cameras are on these people constantly. They just highlight. They might have the camera on them for 20 hours a day or 15 hours a day for a full week, and they're gonna select an hour of that or 45 minutes of content for you and I to see. So that in a way is kind of shaping reality, right, from one perspective. So anyways, that's just something for you to think about. Technology, a lot of advancements. You have high definition television that allows for better resolution, right? Very realistic imagery now. I mean, I was watching a sporting event earlier. I mean, it's pretty incredible now. I mean, especially if you think back to before HD, right? I mean, the before and after, it's pretty incredible. But and that's why a lot of people now, I mean, I have friends that insist that it doesn't pay to go to a game anymore, a sporting event, because they're like, why would I go to the game? I have a 50-inch TV or a 60-inch TV. It's HD. I'm in the comfort of my own home. I'm on my couch. I don't have to spend all this money. I don't have to park. I don't have to go and spend, $10 for a can of pop, a can of soda. Sorry, I'm from Minnesota, so we say pop up here. I know you guys say, I think you guys just say Coke. I think you guys just call it a Coke. But anyways, you don't have to spend all this money, right? And so why go to the game? And part of that is, HD. I mean, the experience is so. I mean, you get people. I have a friend who's got like the home theater, the surround sound, and everything. It's pretty incredible to watch the game. It's a great experience. Digital television, DTV, enables the convergence of computing, television, and telecommunications that makes new storytelling techniques possible, as well as linking to multicast. The multicast is very interesting. This is when a single station provides multiple channels at the same time. And you may have seen this and taken note of this. But this is one of these the newer advancements, and expect more of this kind of thing in the coming years. The technological advancements are coming fast and furious. If you look at the TV industry, we talked about concentration of ownership, consolidation of ownership, and that has affected television as well, right? Just a handful of companies that control the programming distribution market. Now, I think in the Shoals area, if I remember, I don't live in the Shoals. I live in Madison, but I think Comcast is quite dominant, if I remember correctly. Where I live in Madison, we don't even have Comcast as an option. It's Charter cable, right? And we actually have DirecTV. DirecTV is a major player in the satellite industry, and one of the reasons why DirecTV is so popular is the reason that I got DirecTV in the first place is because they have a deal with the NFL, and so they have this thing called Sunday Ticket, which I signed up for, and that's basically where you just get all the games. You get all the NFL games on Sunday and Monday. I mean, you get all the games, but and that was important for me because I think I mentioned this, but I'm a Minnesota Vikings fan. So the Vikings games don't come on in Alabama, so I needed to get the Sunday ticket. So that's why I signed up with DirecTV. But DirecTV, Dish Network, also that's what my mom has here in Minnesota. AT&T, Charter. I mean, these are Bright House. I've never actually heard of. I think that's the only one and Cox. I had never heard of Cox. I think the rest I've heard of. But these are the 10 biggest players. And that's not a lot of companies. When you think about how many markets there are in the United States, hundreds of markets, hundreds of TV markets, and you have 10 companies controlling the programming distribution. Advertising is a key source of revenue, obviously, in television. And given the importance of advertising, it becomes very important to track audiences, right? Ratings become very important. Why is that? Well, if I have a show, and if I can demonstrate that a lot of people watch my show, then advertisers are going to want to advertise. One of the reasons why the NFL is doing so well is because everybody watches the NFL. Not everybody, but a lot of people. It has tremendous viewership. So they just rake in the advertising dollars, right? The Nielsen ratings are particularly important in terms of tracking audience and viewership. What they do is they divide. It's dividing the households that are viewing a program by the total number of TV households, and they do this, by area. So you can see what the Nielsen rating is for a particular show in the Shoals, for example, or in Huntsville, or whatever, right? Online viewing via Hulu and Netflix, which we've discussed. Already very popular, and these are trends that are gonna continue to grow. Here are some ethical guidelines. And these I think would apply for both TV and movies. Is there an adequate warning by the producer for any content that might be deemed unethical? Now these guidelines were developed by a scholar named Louis Alvin Day, and he's specifically talking about violence, right? He wants to come up with a set of guidelines for television and movies that could be useful for the audience, for people like you and me, as we're just trying to decide whether or not we want to watch something on television or want to watch a movie, and also in terms of movies, for movies as well. Do we want our kids to be able to watch a particular TV show, or do we want our kids to be able to watch a particular movie? Are we going to allow them to watch a particular movie, right, that has some violent content in it? And again, we've talked about this, but the whole issue with violence is not so much that there are violent portrayals, but it's that, and specifically ethicists take issue with the fact that many of the violent portrayals are glorified. So you have violent criminals who are glorified, violent acts which are glorified on television. That's what a lot of people take issue with. So that's the larger context. That's why Louis Alvin Day came up with these guidelines. These are not legal guidelines, right? Legally, pretty much, as long as, with some exceptions, you could pretty much do what you want, right? And we have the rating system. You have the rated R and the rated PG-13 that you have to, that your film is going to be rated, or your TV program. You're not going to be able to do certain things on television, particularly in the early hours, before 10 p.m. Is not as much leeway on TV as with movies. But this is not a legal. These are not legal guidelines. These are ethical guidelines, right? Is it ethical? If you're going to get onto the movies, is it ethical for you to produce this kind of content? So that's where some of this comes from. And so what he says, if you're going to make violent, or you're going to produce violent content, ask yourself these 6 questions. Did you include a warning, right? Is there a warning by the producer? At the very minimum, there has to be a warning, right? According to his perspective. Secondly, is the violence gratuitous, or is it essential to the plot? Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky, right? Because a lot of producers, right, a lot of screenplay writers or producers or writers, they would say, oh, of course it's essential, right? It's essential for me this is part of the picture that I'm painting. But is it really? He really wants you to ask critically, is it really necessary to have this violence, to have this level of detail, right? Think about Quentin Tarantino movies. A lot of really gratuitous violence. You can make an argument that Quentin Tarantino, and people have made this argument, that the violence is not necessary to the script, but it's just there to shock you, essentially. And from Louis Alvin Day's perspective, that's not okay, because it's just not essential to the plot. And we could obviously, disagree and debate on that. Does the material depict violence as desirable? That's another issue. And I talked about that. When we glorify violence, we're describing it as desirable, as a desirable solution to a problem, right? And so for some ethicists, that's a problem. Is there punishment for unwarranted acts of violence? Or are those acts rewarded? In a lot of movies, people that carry out the violence are actually rewarded. It ends up being very good for the character. That's a problem, according to some ethicists. Are heroes and villains clearly delineated? From Louis Alvin Day's perspective, the heroes should be the people that aren't, committing gratuitous acts of violence, right? And finally, if there is no just punishment, or if the heroes and villains are not clearly identified, he wants you to ask yourself this: is there some higher public purpose to be served by the use of violence in the plot or script? Now, this is admittedly subjective, but these are some guidelines that I think are useful for us to at least talk about, and think about and grapple with, right? And maybe over time we may decide, as a society, as a media industry, we may decide that some changes are in order. But probably not, frankly, because at the end of the day, it's about making money, and that's what society, fortunately or unfortunately, and in my opinion, unfortunately, but you could disagree, that's what a lot of us want. That's what a lot of people in society want. They want the gratuitous violence. It makes money. And as long as it makes money, they'll continue to produce that kind of content. Now, this is the last thing that I'm going to say in this particular lesson, or for Chapter 5. So this will be the last thing that you have to know for the midterm. It's about cultivation theory. I want you to understand cultivation theory. Cultivation theory is a theory of television effects developed by a scholar named George Gerbner. And the theory basically says that the more people watch TV, the more they will see the real world as a reflection of the TV world. In other words, if you watch a lot of TV, you will begin to see the world like the TV world. In other words, to say it another way, you'll begin to think like the TV. If you watch a lot of TV, right? That's what Gerbner did in his research, and his team still does. He passed away a few years ago. But what they did was they would divide people up into three groups. They would divide people up into three groups. Heavy television viewers, medium television viewers, and then light television viewers. People that don't watch much TV at all. And they would ask them questions about reality. What do you think the chances that you're going to get murdered are? How many old people are there in society? And so on and so forth. Attitudes about marriage, attitudes about love, all kinds of things. And they would find that the people that watch TV a lot would give answers that reflected the TV reality. The people that didn't watch much TV would provide answers that reflected real reality. You understand? I hope that's clear. So cultivation theory assumes that TV content is relatively uniform. So we have a lot of channels, but same storylines, right? Same narratives. That's the assumption. You don't have to agree with this, but I do want to say there's quite a bit of evidence for cultivation theory. They've done hundreds of studies. But some scholars, take issue with some aspects of cultivation theory. Another assumption of cultivation theory is that viewers are fairly non-selective. Another assumption is that television is a key shaper of culture in modern society. That's why Gerbner started to do this research in the first place. And back in the 1960s, he was sitting back going, this is incredible. Like, everybody just comes home from work or school and they plop down on the couch and watch TV for hours. And he's like, this is becoming like so socially dominant that we have to study it. What is it doing to us? How is it affecting our perceptions of reality? And then he started to do this research, and he started to get this data, and that's when he came up with cultivation theory. This is a telling quote from Gerbner. He says, television is a centralized system of storytelling. This is kind of his main argument. Its drama, commercials, news, and other programs bring a relatively coherent system of images and messages into every home. That system cultivates from infancy the predispositions and preferences that used to be acquired from other primary sources, right? Television has become the primary common source of socialization and everyday information. So it's not school, right? It's not the family unit, it's TV. That's his belief. In cultivation analysis, television content is analyzed and compared with data from the real world. I kind of already explained it. So, this is just an example. They'll ask people. So what they do is, if pretend you're George Gerbner's research team, what they do is they basically count up, for example, how many crimes there are in real life, how many old people there are in real life, and then they count up how many there are on TV in programs, right? Per unit, per program, right? And then they go out and they ask people about their perceptions. How much crime do you think there is? How many murders do you think occur? What is the likelihood that you will be murdered? What is the likelihood that you will be struck with a weapon? What percentage of the population owns a gun? Things like that. How many old people are there in society? How many young people are there in society? And what they find, again, is that people that watch a lot of TV give answers that are consistent with TV world, not real world, right? So the people that watch a lot of TV, they greatly exaggerate the violence that there is in society. They greatly exaggerate the chances that they will be killed by someone else. Because why? Why do they say that? Because they watch a lot of TV and there's a lot of violence on TV. They also greatly underestimate the number of old people in society because there aren't that many old people on TV. There are almost no old people on TV. Right? There are a lot more old people in real life. I mean, just percentage-wise, proportionally. Dozens of studies have been conducted over the last 30 years that have found evidence of a cultivation effect in various contexts, right? Here are some examples. So researchers have found that heavy television viewers perceive social phenomena, violence in society, elderly people in society, out-of-wedlock childbirth, gender differences, marriage, work, science, the environment, and many other examples in ways that differ from social realities and correspond closely with TV realities. In other words, they start to absorb the narrative or narratives that television is producing, which are not consistent in many cases with real life. I already mentioned the stuff about elderly people. They call this the mean world syndrome, where the people just think people that watch a lot of TV think the world is meaner than it is. There are more crimes than there actually are. People cannot be trusted. People are more selfish. More protection is needed. So they develop kind of a complex, people that watch a lot of TV, according to Gerbner and the cultivation research. One study showed that heavy viewers of TV scored higher on a sexism scale. Other studies have found that heavy television viewing leads to a stereotypical view of gender. These are just examples that I'm mentioning, but there have been dozens of different kinds of cultivation effects that they found. Another finding is that heavy viewers are more likely to accept out-of-wedlock childbirth and single parenthood, two phenomena that are overrepresented on TV as compared with the real-life data. The most widely cited examples are about violence, and this is what I mentioned about the mean world syndrome. So that's cultivation theory. It's a theory of television effects, but it's been used now in other contexts. So one scholar, we'll talk about this later in the semester, I just want you to know this. I mean, this won't be on the test, but just FYI. One scholar did research using cultivation theory on video games. So he thinks that there is a cultivation effect from video games. In other words, if you play a lot of video games, you will begin to think like the video game. And we'll talk more about that later. So this is it for Chapter 5. Let me know if you guys have questions about any of this content. Let me know if you have questions about the midterm. The midterm, by the way, multiple choice, true-false questions. Maybe a couple of short answers. We'll see. Okay? That's it.